That's my MCP config. It's just 7 lines of code and it gives access to my Claude Code into my private deployed database on AWS RDS. Let's see how that works. If I go to Claude Code and I tell it, can you show me some data? And count how many authors we have. It instantly knows which MCP to use, and then it uses this MCP to talk to your database. So we can see we have an author count of 5, we see some data, I seeded the database with some example data, and the really cool thing is this database is not in the internet. It doesn't have a fixed IP, it runs in a private subnet secured in an AWS VPC, and we're still able to access it. So in this video I want to show you how you can connect your Claude Code or your AI assistant of choice to your private deployed databases in a VPC and how we can do that in a secure way. But first of all, who am I? My name is Sandro. I'm a full-stack software engineer. I've been working with AWS for the past 6-7 years and I've built lots of projects with serverless development. And I want to show you how I use my AI coding assistants day by day, because it really changed the way I'm working on a daily basis, and I needed to figure out a lot of things to make it even better. And I think this is one of the major things, is to give it better context, is to give it better data. And this is what I want to show you today. So first of all, I want to look at the overall problem from an AI angle, because I think it's actually interesting to see how good AI coding assistants perform with which amount of context. Because typically people always say, or I would say, you as a developer always want to give it more information, more context, and think that it works out better. But I think it's actually the inverse, because the more context it gets, the worse it performs. This is also why we typically say you need to clear your context after every feature. But if you look at that in a really non-scientific graph here, let's map the number of context we have in here, and let's put this a bit down, and let's say performance here. And we simply do this percentage wise. We say this is 0 on both axes and this is 100. You as a developer always want to give it more information, more context, and think that it works out better. But I think it's actually the inverse, because the more context it gets, the worse it performs. This is also why we typically say you need to clear your context after every feature. But if you look at that in a really non-scientific graph here, let's map the number of context we have in here, and let's put this a bit down, and let's say performance here. And we simply do this percentage wise. We say this is 0 on both axes and this is 100. And what I think it looks like, that the more context you give, the less it performs. So we start out with performance 100, whatever that means, and the more context we give, the worse the model will get. So you start out with feature 1 here, it's quite good, and you start out with feature 2 here, and so on, and you never clear the context, and the context window fills up, and then it gets worse and worse. How I actually think it behaves on a day-to-day basis is a bit different, because I think what we're doing is we don't start even with 100, we start with, let's say, 50 in the middle, and then we start out. So we make a spec, for example, so we give it some information, we try to give it the best information as possible, but then the tool itself starts filling up its context by using the tools. This is, I think, where Claude Code really shines. So it reads some files, it uses some skills, it uses some APIs, MCP, CLIs, whatever you use, and it fills it up with more context. But I think the important part here, it fills it up with relevant context for the specific task. So I don't think the more context it gets to a certain degree, it will worsen, but at the beginning, it will really perform better. So let's say we read a file, we read a database schema, we look at some data, and then it understands actually what it needs to do. After that, so if we say, okay, feature complete is here, we give it more context and we don't clear it again. And for example, we work on a second feature, what I really wouldn't recommend. Then it goes down and down and down and down until it's not as good anymore. And Of course, this is a bit overemphasis how good and how bad it is, but what just my main point is, we want to learn how we can give the correct context in this area. So I think it's really important that we understand somehow how can we reach that. It already goes down here. Yeah, that we reach a good amount of context, give it some focused context, that it even performs better. But then we need to ask the question like, what is a focused context? What is data we really need while developing? And I think it often comes down to the database. Your whole application relies on data. You have relations in your data, everything sticks together. So I think it is very important that you give your AI assistant to some extent access to your database. And of course, this is not just about the actual data which is in the database, but also about the database schema. What developers typically are doing, they go to their SQL workbench, get out the schema, copy paste it back into Claude Code every time, or put it into the context somewhere. And I don't think this is necessary because we have the tools available. So let's use them. So what I would say, what we have in this context typically is we have DB schema, we have maybe some example data, and then of course all of the files, all of the existing code that your assistant can already read. So there are different things, but I think this is a good start and we really want to take care of the database angle here. So let's start with that. All right, so the second problem we can see is actually a networking problem because our RDS is deployed in a private subnet in a VPC. So it is not in the internet. We cannot connect via IP from everywhere. And this is also supposed to be that way. So don't have your database, if possible, in the internet. But how do we actually overcome this problem? And this is by introducing a few more components into that. So we have Claude here, which is simply our local machine. Then we have a session manager. And the session manager is a CLI tool you can install. So it uses your local AWS credentials of your CLI and it can connect to AWS. And then it actually connects via VPC endpoints. So you need to add these VPC endpoints. I think we have 3 different ones here to be able to connect to your jump host. So going through these VPC endpoints, we go into our jump host. And the jump host is in the same subnet as the RDS. And this jump host can connect to your RDS. And this is how you get the whole flow of a local tunnel via session manager to VPC endpoints to your jump host into RDS. And this is what we reuse to connect it to Claude Code. Just to reiterate on that, let's have a look at the code here. So we have 3 scripts. We have the MCP Postgres script, which is actually our whole MCP server. And what it is doing, it is starting a session. So it starts a tunnel and it starts a session with AWS SSM. You need to have this installed. Before that, it gets some data from CloudFormation and it actually connects through this session. So it forwards all requests to localhost on this port to your RDS instance. All right, then we want to deploy it. So we say pnpm cdk deploy. Let's wait a second and see what happens. So now it synthesizes it, makes it into CloudFormation, makes a stack set. So we approve all of the IAM changes here, and then it starts deploying it. All right, it is deployed. So what we're doing next is that we actually want to start the tunnel now. So because what we also have is we have a script for starting the tunnel manually. So I'm doing this, I go into scripts tunnel. And what the script is doing, it is fetching some CloudFormation outputs just to make things easier, like the instance, the RDS endpoint, and then it starts the SSM tunnel. Now we want to seed some data because at the moment the database is empty. So what we're doing is we execute a seed script. It again fetches some credentials and seeding the database. You can see on the left side now we have a connection accepted. So we have a connection and then you can see some examples on what we got. Let's also have a look into the database manually once. I will use pgcli for that. So I connect via pgcli host localhost port 5432, user Postgres database demo. Important, I saved the password already in PG password. You can't see it. And now we can look at some data. So execute some queries. So let's see, for example, public authors, and then we can see some data. I really like pgcli. All right, that's the main part. Now we have data and we have data seeded. The next part is connecting it to Claude Code. And like I said at the beginning of this video, it is just these 7 lines. Of course, it is not entirely true because we have our MCP Postgres script, which I showed you already. What it's basically doing, it checks some requirements, it gets some stack outputs, it gets the credentials, starts the tunnel, and then starts the MCP server. And you can see that the MCP server is running. So we just go out of here and now start Claude Code. If you make changes to Claude Code, you always need to restart it, which is a bit annoying. And then we can look at MCPs and you can see RDS Postgres is connecting at this moment. So we wait a bit at what it's doing. It's creating a separate tunnel in the background. So this actually doesn't need to run. We can remove that. It creates its own tunnel. It is now connected. And now what we can do is we can say, show me some data and give me an overview of it in the database. Best part is you don't always need to say in the database, but that depends a bit on how you structure your ClaudeMD and your skills. And now it starts thinking, and I hope it understands to use this MCP because it is a database, and then it should show us some data. Here you can see RDS Postgres, it just has the tool query, so it executes the queries. And then we can see it gets the tables, it gets some authors, and now you can use this to troubleshoot incidents, to do feature development or whatever you want. Here you can see an overview of the tables. We have authors, we have posts, and we have a summary of that. So I really love that, and I think it is super easy to do. And now think about what that means for you. You are debugging an incident and you can actually look at the data, or you're building a new feature and you want to give Claude Code a feedback loop, right? I think that's what Matt Pocock also always says. The AI performs much better if you give it proper feedback. And yes, this works with unit tests, with integration tests, you also see the database. But now if you build a full stack feature end to end, we can actually click in the UI via some headless playwright, for example, and then it can check the database if the database is as expected. And then it can also write a test for that. But I think giving it access to the database is really crucial here. But now onto the last part, which we can't forget, and I think which many people already see, is security. Is it secure that you connect it to your database? First of all, don't connect it to a production database. I'm not sure if this is obvious, but this is what I would not do. Also, if I say troubleshoot incidents, you have hopefully a staging environment which behaves exactly the same as your production environment, and you only want to do it for staging or development. So first point, only dev and staging. Don't connect it to your production environment. Really important. Then the second point. The MCP we are using here is actually only allowing read requests. So even if you only have the tool query, we could only do read. So let's say read only. But I would not 100% trust that, because MCPs can be changed. There can be some weird MCPs out there. And what I would do actually is to add an additional read-only user. Since I do this on staging and this is a demo, I didn't do that, but this is something to keep in mind. Create a staging read-only user. Then a few things which I really like. So we go through Session Manager. That means we don't have any hard-coded long-lived tokens. It uses your local AWS CLI. Also, Session Manager logs everything to CloudTrail. So that means you have an overview of who connected at what time and what they did. So you don't see the whole executions of queries, of course, but you can see an overview of which API calls were done in this time. So the audit trail is there, and this is really good. But in general, the security part here, which I really like, is we are in the private subnet. So we have two different networks. So we cannot have our database in the internet here, and this is how we still connect to it. I made a whole VPC infographic that shows everything around virtual private clouds, which is the basic of everything in AWS, as you will see in many of your applications. We cover many of these subjects here. We cover subnets, we cover VPC private links, we cover how we can set up VPCs in an efficient way. Make sure to check it out, grab it, and let me know what you think. So the link is down in the description. Also, the link to the GitHub repository with all of the CDK code is in there as well. It's open source. Grab it, deploy it on your own. And if you have a demo, don't forget to destroy it again. And if this helps you building real world AWS skills, real world full stack development skills, and not just pass exams, please let me know. Also, if you have any other tips working with Claude Code, let us know and we'll check it out. Thank you so much and see you soon.